Colin is the seventh podcaster to appear on Twin Peaks Conversations, and the third guest who has had me on their own show before I invited them on mine. In his case, I recorded an episode on Sarah Palmer, which will be released soon. Colin's podcast, Creamed Corn in the Universe, goes character by character through the series, and in this episode, we'll discuss why he chose that approach, how far he plans to take it, and why he's brought on various guests along the way. Lately, he's been engaging with the secret history of Twin Peaks, deep diving into characters like Meriwether Lewis, who Mark Frost's book has de facto made part of the Twin Peaks ensemble. We'll also explore Colin's thoughts on the original series film in Season 3. As always, the larger part of this conversation will be reserved for $5 a month patrons on patreon.com/lostinthemovies. Before we begin the public part, here's what I've been working on elsewhere. $1 a month patrons are in the midst of an extensive decades exploration project, in which I offer brief reviews and a few longer ones of films from the past 4 decades, the 80s, 90s, zeros, and teens, plus shorter sections on the 70s, 60s, and 50s. Currently, I'm on the 90s and the 70s, with my latest podcast presenting full reviews of Pulp Fiction and Clute. Earlier in the month, I concluded my 80s focus with full reviews of Red Dawn, Do the Right Thing, and Hail Mary. Dozens of other capsules are featured in this two-parter. I published a Halloween special discussing Bram Stoker's Dracula, alongside updates on my media feedback and behind-the-scenes activity for October. Advanced previews of my Twin Peaks character series shared the 70th, 68th, and 67th ranked characters of the series, based on screen time. It shared them with patrons, so won't be shared with the public until the spring, so you can join up not just to discover who these characters are, but also read their full entries. On my public podcast feeds, I shared a Lost in the Movies episode on the 40s proto-noir, The Shanghai Gesture. And I actually have another Lost in the Movies episode since the previous Twin Peaks Conversations, A Vulnerable Throne. It covers 4 films, The Bitter Tea of General Yan, Knights of the Round Table, Land of Pharaohs, and also Rasputin and the Empress. And a Twin Peaks Cinema episode on Back to the Future Part 2, drawing connections between that blockbuster sequel and the conclusion of Season 3 of Twin Peaks. Before the next Twin Peaks Conversations episode goes up in November, I'm hoping to renew the Lost in Twin Peaks episode by episode podcast, so stay tuned for that. One more thing I want to say, usually this podcast appears promptly by the end of each month, but this one is a little later than usual. There are logistical reasons for that, but the timing also works out because by now, Colin has released the Sarah episode on which I guested before we recorded this. So you can hear that episode of Creamed Corn in the Universe linked below, along with the rest of the podcast. In addition to 30 public and 40 patron exclusive minutes for which I'm hosting him, his hosting of me provides another free 2 hours of conversation between us on a very particular topic. So make sure to check out us talking about Sarah Palmer as well. For now, let's join Colin for a discussion of his own work on the show. So I have here with me Colin, the host of Creamed Corn in the Universe. Pretty creative podcast in terms of its approach, but also in terms of its name. So to start with, I know you've addressed this elsewhere, but let's tell our listeners as well, what inspired this particular name?
My thing is that when I started off with the idea of a character-based podcast, I wanted to think of some that could encapsulate all of Twin Peaks at large. Because my takeaway is that I think of if next week I did an episode about Hank and then I did another episode about the man from another place the week after, those are completely different facets of Twin Peaks and different conversations, different ways to discuss it. And I was trying to think of something that could fit the bill for the broadest spectrum of Twin Peaks. And I remember one night I was actually listening to, or actually really watching the Log Lady intros. I kind of was trying to find inspiration. And I get to the one for episode 9 where she starts talking about, she's like, what really is creamed corn and how does it fit into the workings of the universe? And I just thought it's a little bit unwieldy, but I think I can make this work. So, and I thought it just kind of it was a very Twin Peaks specific, but also very unique in its own right. So it was mostly the Log Lady intros I can thank for that.
It's interesting how much those intros really add. I mean, the Laura is the one thing. Which I think springs off from James in the pilot saying she was the one, but until the Log Lady, nobody says the words Laura is the one. And then what was some of the other stuff? Some of the stuff about only when you are everywhere will you understand, or something like that from I think episode 16. Just all these little phrases and ideas that actually kind of come from the Log Lady intros. It's interesting to think of the fact that, they came 2 years later or whatever.
I guess in terms of my biggest takeaway outside of Lore's the One, I think of I believe it was for episode 28, where it shows the fireplace where it's boarded up.
Yeah.
And that's why anyone who listens to my show, where I seem to say this like at least every other episode, where I view fire as like an explicitly nefarious type of thing. Even I kind of have some conjecture where it might contradict, but it's mostly from that intro where I kind of come from that like fire is primarily like a terrible thing, or that it's usually its intentions are usually malevolent.
Now, with your podcast, obviously, as we mentioned, you do character by character, different character I guess it's every week or so, right?
Yep. Oh yeah, it's been every week
Yeah.
for since May.
What determines for you the order? Because um, I know I'm doing a character series that's like a written one, and I decided to go with kind of screen time and do like a ranking of who had the most, and starting with the least. But with yours, you sort of weave in and out of certain. It's interesting. Like sometimes I know you're doing sort of a secret history focus now. I think you did like the Renette one around the time you did Laura. Is there a rhyme and reason to it, or is it more the guests you bring on and what is sort of convenient for you to look at the time?
In the case of the Secret History specials, it's mostly I'm trying to go in the order that they appear in the Secret History. That one I was a little more deliberate about, and also trying to get an idea of like who would be the right person for it. Like for example, I think of like Take the Ring, where I was thrilled that he wanted to do the Meriwether Lewis episode because if anyone's watched his channel, he's extremely comprehensive about the Secret History. He's extremely comprehensive on the book when he does podcasts, and I just want to make sure I had like the right people for that. But as for co-hosts in general, I mostly just kind of go by like whatever my co-host wants to do because I guess this is probably a good way to kind of explain why I have my show formatted the way it is. Is that where I live, there's people that do like Twin Peaks, but I don't know if it's really anyone who would do it on a weekly basis with me. But I was thinking about all the times where I've been to cons or I've been to Washington or people I've befriended online. And I thought I was like, oh, I would love to talk with this person, or I'd like to talk with them again and see how they've been. So it kind of worked out in that regard where I just reach out to people and they'll be like, hey, I would like to do an episode about this character. Or sometimes I'll reach out to them and say, hey, I think they'd be good for this. And then we'll kind of compromise. So in terms of the secret history, that was a pretty specific choice. But in terms of every other character, I kind of just go by what that co-host wants to do, and then I just try to go along and just do the research I can, and sometimes I'll do a rewatch. For the most part, I just go by what they're aiming for.
And doing it on a weekly basis, I mean, you could run this for years and years. So maybe this question isn't really relevant, but are you saving certain characters to near quote unquote the end, or if you shift your approach or something at some point? Like thinking specifically of Cooper. You have done a Laura episode, but I think it was specifically her last 7 days. So are you saving certain big ones for later in the game, or could you see yourself just kind of covering on those as the opportunity arises?
Yeah, I think for the most part for me, I'm trying to aim for just trying to do a one and done for most characters. But I think in the case of characters like Laura or Cooper or Diane, I feel like they're so multifaceted that you could kind of like fixate on one aspect of them. Like, for example, you brought up the Laura Palmer last 7 days that before the year's out, I want to do a Laura Palmer and the Missing Pieces, which I should be recording within the next week at the time of this recording. Then also there's one about like the Secret Diary. There's about like, her in the Black Lodge, Carrie Page. And that's like at least 5 episodes right there where you can
Yeah.
really tap into Laura. And then in the case of Cooper, I will point this out is that I actually want my last episode to be a specifically Dale Cooper specific episode. But I think until then, you could do a lot with the My Life, My Tapes, the Dougie Tulpa, Mr. C, Dougie Jones. There's, all these other facets you could do. And as for Diane, of course, there's the Diane Tulpa we see in season 3. There's the real Diane. There's Nato, and then there's Linda. Oh, and I guess also for Cooper to come back, Richard as well. So there's multifacets that I can do. And then, of course, there's stuff like Leland and Bob, where there's a lot of double dipping with that. And I guess this one's a little bit of a stretch, but I think it could work. Is that I did my Audrey Horne episode, but I also think of how if I did an episode about Charlie, that can really tap into Audrey specifically through the lens of season 3. So I've kind of thought about like through that lens where You can kind of talk about one character through the lens of another. For example, I've done 25 episodes so far, and I feel like Cooper comes up at least once every other episode at least. So it doesn't really feel like it's quite missing in that regard. And I feel like I can still bring up a lot of these characters even without it being central to that character, even though haven't covered them yet.
Yeah, and you're not afraid to detour too. Like sometimes you'll have fascinating parts of the podcast that aren't even related to that specific character. It's just a topic that came up in the conversation and you kind of let it go there with the person. It gives like it's almost like the character gives you a touch point or a foundation to build on.
The one thing I do mention, and I'm sure because I saw him last weekend, and I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear this, is that when I did the first episode I released with Martin was the Gordon Cole episode where we talked quite a bit about Denise, and a lot of it was to kind of cycle back to Gordon Cole about how he felt about the Fix Our Hearts or Die. You can kind of deviate from that character and still have it cycle back because with my co-host, I feel like regardless of what I talk with, there's usually a pretty good flow of how to cycle it back and how to kind of bring back to like what the character in that discussion. But yeah, I'm totally fine with like deviating a little bit. I do remember my early days where it's like I think it was actually when I did the Harry Truman episode with James. I think we were talking about another character for the briefest moment. And he actually asked me in the recording, he's like, "Hey, is it okay if we talk about this?" And yeah, that's the thing is that there's so much the way these characters are interconnected that there's just something that I feel like it would almost be I would be remiss if I just kind of like kept it strictly explicitly about the one character.
Did you ever consider other approaches or was it always a character podcast that you wanted to do?
I think for me, it was always a character specific one because, there's a lot of people out there that have a great thing going with the episode based podcasts. And then there's people like Twin Peaks Unwrapped when they finished all the episodes in Fire Walk with Me, where they kind of found ways to deviate into it. But I think about it, and I was actually talking about Take the Ring after we record the Meriwether Lewis episode, is that, for example, with Harry Truman, we see him in pretty much just the original series, but that's only a month out of his whole life. And then you see stuff in the Access Guide of the Town where there's the ritualistic ceremony that they do every 5 years. And to me, stuff like that completely changes the character. Or I guess another example is that with Josie Packard, where she's only in a few entries of the Secret Diary of Laura Palmer, the way she's described in it, it just changes, not completely changes the character dynamic, but it challenges a lot of my notions of her. And I kind of think like, how does this work, or how do I approach this? How does this fit alongside with what we know about Josie? And so I take it from there in a lot of cases.
You were mentioning even before we recorded how you and I recorded a few weeks ago. And can I say upcoming episodes? Are they
Oh,
surprises or
oh no,
no?
absolutely.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
So we did one on Sarah Palmer, and you were reminding me how I said we were like an hour into it, and I said something like, "Gee, we're an hour into it, and we're only now getting to the original series because we'd covered it chronologically." And so we talked about part 8, we talked about Fire Walk with Me and the missing pieces and all of that, and then finally we got to the original series like almost halfway through. With the approach you take, it's interesting how sometimes the most peripheral material in Twin Peaks can suddenly become almost like more proportional, like you can give it all this time and attention, even though it's just this little book to the side of the official series, because it covers so much more of their lives than the series itself does.
It's like we mentioned the episode where we talk about the final dossier for a little bit, where I know that when that came out, there was a bit of a clash of people who thought the girl in part 8 was Sarah, and others that just thought that made no sense whatsoever. And that's the thing that, like, in the case of talking about a character like Sarah, there's a lot about that foundation early on that you need to establish and then kind of build off of. Because, yeah, because I think we mentioned it after the recording for the episode is that I almost look at the original series as like a subversive soap opera where it was always meant to kind of divulge further. So when you get stuff like The Secret Diary, Fire Walk with Me, the Mark Frost books, season 3, where I feel like those everything we see in the original series is almost like character archetypes that Frost and Lynch created, and then what they do with everything subsequently. That's what springboards into those characters and how they build off that mythology.
Yeah, and I think with season 3, it's funny, it feels even more explicitly like peeks into these lives that you don't get the bigger picture of. I think in the original series, they intended it to go for years. I think they had their doubts about whether it would last that long. But you did want to feel like you were there with the characters day to day, you were a part of their lives and you knew them well after a little while. At first they're very mysterious, but as time goes along. But in season 3, you really get the sense of like it's almost like you're going to a reunion and you're meeting someone and you connect and it's nice to see them, but you kind of realize I've missed so much of this person's life now. I don't know all these things that have happened over the decades, and I'm kind of a stranger peeking in. You really get that with season 3, where it's like you don't even know for 3 or 4 episodes if Shelley and Bobby are still married. Like you're not on the same page with the characters anymore. I found that interesting. It's almost like an alternative soap opera style where it's like designing a soap opera where you are only tuning in the middle of the action and then tuning right back out. Like if you compile each character's arcs in that, you're lucky if it would amount to one episode of TV.
I remember the first time I watched season three. It's one of those where it, for the most part, gets better each time I rewatch it because I think of stuff like Duncan Todd, for example, where how unceremonious a lot of his stuff was. And to be honest, out of all the plot threads, that probably was the most unceremonious to me. It just seems so such like a mishmash. But then you look at something in a broader perspective, like, you know, whether people watch as an 18-hour movie or they
Mm-hmm.
revisit on a day-to-day basis, people have their own ways of how to rationalize season three or in some cases just disavow season three. That's a really good point you bring up about how it's like being at a reunion of like how much this has been going on in their life in that 25 years, and you realize how long 25 years truly is, like
Yeah,
when you watch those early episodes in particular.
it's funny you mentioned Duncan Todd because that actor, what's his name? I'm trying to remember.
I forget his name
Patrick
too,
Fischler.
but
That's it.
yeah, because the
Yeah,
thing that he's absolutely great in Mulholland Drive. He's,
yeah,
I mean, I know he's only has two scenes really, but
yeah.
he, to me, he steals the show in it. So it is kind of funny that he's kind of handed this, this plot thread that it's the probably the only plot thread in my opinion that doesn't really go anywhere, where you can kind of see the things that are starting to build up, but then Chantal, she just shows
Yeah,
up and shoots him.
he's gone. Him and Roger. But it's funny because I guess there's that one scene where he goes to like a lockbox and opens it up and does something with it. So I can't remember if he rolls his chair or stands up, but it's quite possible he never stands up for the entirety of his scenes in the show. Ben Horn, same thing. I don't think he ever. Oh, he stands to shake Frank Truman's hand. That's about it. He's looking for the sound, so he does
Yeah,
stand up and walk
yeah,
around,
that's
but he never
actually
leaves
one.
the room.
Yeah, that's one thing that I thought of is that I know that in the case of Lynch, he's had you know, like he only had actors for set time, so
Yeah.
he just wanted to get his scenes done, their scenes done. But I also think that a theme of confinement is like a huge part of season three, where it's
Yes,
like all
for
these people are
sure.
just kind of locked in doing the same thing day to day. Like I think of it with Norma, where I know that she steps up every now and then, but you just think of how locked in she is to her job and how she's kind of answering to this larger corporation, and a lot of people are just kind of like removed in a lot of cases. So
Yeah.
I remember that was something I picked up on right away. I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but the more I time goes on, the more I think that no, this is a huge part of season three and how all these characters are kind of removed and kind of how they like or like maybe why they interact the way they do with other characters.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a great point. It's he kind of created what was probably partially a production condition because you had such a huge cast and you're telling a more like focused story in a way than the original series. So you kind of have to and shooting it like a movie too. That's a big deal. Like it's like so he can actually organize it in a way where it's like we're going to shoot all this person's scenes on the set at once and then move on to the other stuff. Whereas that's not at all how seasons 1 and 2 were shot. You know,
Yeah.
they were shot. You come in this week and you do your scenes. You come in the next week and you do your scenes, and it's like it's a whole different thing. It that alone would give it more of a compressed feel, I think.
And I guess the other one before we get back in the questions is that with Lynch, where I always view him as like more of an artist than like a filmmaker in a lot of cases, where he wants things to kind of like yeah, I think of like the season two finale for example, where everything moves relatively slowly for the most part in the Black Lodge, and how you just get that certain feeling as you keep navigating through those events. And I think he was trying to do that with season. I know that's a bit reductive, you know, be like, oh, I'm trying to get what Lynch is trying to say, but I think that's why there's that theme of confinement and why you see a lot of people just stuck in the same set spot is that there's just something about that type of storytelling where you can tell a lot within one scene. And I think that's, at least from what I've gathered, that I feel like that's a big takeaway for Lynch.
An interesting history with the show. If I understand correctly, maybe I'm wrong about this. Did you say on in a previous conversation that you did not see any Twin Peaks till after the return?
Yeah, that's complete. In
Yeah,
fact, I was actually
that's
a fan.
fascinating to me.
Yeah, I was actually a fan of chromatics for years before I got
Wow,
into Twin Peaks. So
that's
that
wild.
was yeah, well, it wasn't like the main reason why I got into the show, but it was one of those things that I was kind of like, oh, maybe I should try it out. And even stuff like I actually listened to Julie Cruz's Falling like months before I got into Twin Peaks. And then actually I remember renting it once, and then I just didn't have the time to watch the pilot. Luckily, it was the international pilot, so I'm glad that I
Oh
held
yeah.
off.
So that would have
But
been way back, huh?
yeah, that would have been like a while back at this point. But yeah, that's but it's really weird where it's like I knew that there was people whose opinions I trusted where the way they talked about it, I was like, yeah, this sounds like it'd be something that's up my alley in terms of how it raises more questions than answers and like in my opinion like the best way possible. And that's just like the type of thing where it's a pretty good way to like not really get burned out on talking about it because I think of stuff like people who love, like, say, specifically the original Star Wars trilogy, where obviously it's a big deal and it really changed the wheel of the 70s and 80s, but it's the kind of thing I feel like that can be dormant in someone's mind. But in the case of Twin Peaks, there's always like a different thing that someone has, a different take, and it can like help you reevaluate in a lot of cases. Because one of the things I like to do for my show is that I never want to be that type of person where I'm imposing my thoughts on it. And also, I'm all for people challenging like how I feel about it and hearing what they get out of it because even little things, like for example, when I did my Andy episode, I don't have kids, but my co-host Craig did, and we were talking about the Wally Brando scene, and I remember I was talking about how just silly just Wally Brando was all around, and how what Frank Truman got out of it, and I remember Craig said something effective how for Frank, since he lost his son, that maybe a lot of that has to do with like memories that these are moments that he could never share with his son again, and it really changed my outlook on how I viewed Frank Truman and how that all went out.
I would be interested to have you walk us through a little bit of your history of this because it's so different for me. I feel like there's, and not in terms of age necessarily, because like Brad Dukes, for example, is only a couple years older than me, but he watched Twin Peaks, I think, 18 years before I did. So it's like there's almost generations of viewership where it's like the people who watched it when it was immediately on, not that many people discovered it in the years in between. Like some people did, but until it came out on the gold box in like 2008, it was kind of like you either watched it when it was on or you probably knew of it but hadn't seen it. And then when that came out, that was that, and the streaming on Netflix, I feel like, was the next big wave where it was like millennials, particularly, really started discovering Twin Peaks. But then somebody getting to it like after the return, I feel like that's a whole new wave. And now we're at the point where somebody who did not watch or follow it when it was on the return is now doing this super in-depth detailed deep dive podcast on it. It's like that's how long it's been that like somebody who discovered it after the return can already be this deep into the weeds, which is fascinating to me.
This one actually shocks people. It was actually only in August of 2019 that I actually got around to watching it. That was like before everything was it was all on Paramount Plus when it was like
Yeah,
on like every streaming service. I think it was actually strange enough on Netflix that I watched it. Yeah, so I remember it was like late summer where I was living on my own in this like new studio apartment. And I was like, all right, well, it's getting colder out. I should probably like, see if there's anything good. And I was going through my backlogs. This is something I've been meaning to watch for a while. And I don't want to be like that video essayist type of guy where it's like how I felt like every moment of watching the pilot. But I just remember just being just like blown away. I would say everything from the pilot to Leland's death is like the most engaging TV I've ever watched. Where it was something I never have I watched a show where I just felt that active about like, oh, what do I think of this, or how do I feel about this character, or how do I feel about this clash of genres, if you will. And yeah, I just remember like every day it would be like I gotta go home and see like where this goes. And yeah, so I watched the original series in the span of like a week or so, and then I didn't even know that Fire Walk With Me was even a thing till I finished the original series. And that's a whole thing in and of itself. Because I would say if there's anything that made me the fan I am, it is definitely Fire Walk With Me.
yeah, that's my definitely my favorite part of Twin Peaks as well. So I had the experience that people in 1990 didn't have, which is I rented the DVDs from Netflix in 2008, watched them in the space of a few weeks, jumped right into Fire Walk With Me, got that whole experience together. And then when the return comes, I have years beforehand, 2014, 15, 16, 17, preparing, thinking about Twin Peaks, doing a huge chunk of my work during that time period, and then watching it week to week. So this is a difficult question for you to answer because it's a little bit like asking a fish, what's it like not to, breathe air, or a person, what's it like not to take water and it's hard to know what you're in, but what is it like to watch Twin Peaks and just be able to go right into the return and have it sort of taken for granted that this thing is coming and then watching it.
I guess if I'm going with the preconceptions I had based off of friends and other people I've seen, I remember thinking that the original series would be inherently darker than it initially was.
Mm,
Because I think of, for example, when I talk about Fire Walk with Me in season three, I always view that this is the trajectory I thought Twin Peaks would go in terms of like the
right.
darkness.
Yeah.
Maybe in terms of Fire Walk with Me, I didn't think it would reach that levels of like explicitness, but I did think that the general dark tone is that would have always been there. Like for example, I was thinking of the first season where that was always the backdrop of the subversive soap opera. And then
Hmm.
when I remember seeing the giant in particular in the season two premiere, I was like, oh, this is where the soap opera elements are going to recede away. And they kind of did, and they kind of didn't. I mean, I know season two as a whole, there's a lot to unpack with season two and of itself, both in universe and behind the scenes. But I do remember when I got to Fire Walk with Me, there's some about it that rang true to me. I was like, this is kind of the trajectory I thought it was going to go because I think of like for example, how many people just hated Fire Walk with Me upon its release. Like it was a critical and commercial bomb. But I think of like the elements that are in there. I was like, no, this is kind of what it's always been about to me. This is like everything about this like high school girl getting murdered. Like this is not like a fun subject matter. And I always kind of thought the show would like recede away, and then that's what we ultimately got for Fire Walk with Me in season three, and of course the books as well. I feel like the a lot of the campiness is primarily the original series, and I do
Hmm.
like it, but and of course season three also has a lot of great laughs as well. But I do view Twin Peaks in probably to a fault to a more serious lens.
With season three, was there a sensation as you watched it of like catching up with something, or like, because again, like I was talking about, for me, it was like less than a decade between first watching the show and watching it. For people who watched it originally, it was 25 years, but for you, it was hours, maybe days, that you were able to jump forward in time. Did it have a feel did you have a sense while you were watching it of this being something new, or was it really only as new to you as the original series, if that makes sense? Because you were seeing it all for the first time.
I think for me, obviously, I wasn't there for like the 20, I wasn't there for like a major gap, like there wasn't an absence, but I could see the transition of like the original series to Fire Walk with Me and then the missing pieces, because the missing pieces is actually a really good way to segue into season three, where
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more about that post season two part about like the Owl Cave ring, about Mr. C. And but I think my big takeaway is that how different it all felt. I think it was you that said it years back on Twin Peaks Unwrapped, where season three feels more like a sequel to Mulholland Drive than it does to Twin Peaks. And I remember I don't know if a hard time, but there was that part of me for the first like four or five parts where I thought, what if I don't like this? Like, what if this is one of those situations like George Lucas with the Phantom Menace where no one wanted to challenge David Lynch on something? What if it just like completely falls on its face? And I was one of those people where during part 17, I was actually worried. I thought, oh no, is this where it's just like everything collapses in on itself? Luckily, I'm actually one of those people where I love part 18, so I'm not really on that end. But that was my big takeaway was that I was kind of looking at more like the visual aesthetic of how different it was, how different the
Mm-hmm.
storytelling was. And I know I mentioned this in my Goran Cole episode, but I really didn't put it past Lynch to have every plot thread basically be like the Duncan Todd one, where I honestly thought each one, because it would show it's like, oh, it's going from Buckhorn, South Dakota to Twin Peaks to New York City to Buenos Aires. And I honestly thought for a moment, it's like, what if this is all just, he's kind of meandering around and then it's like, it's just going to end unceremoniously. And I had a hard time coping with that. But it's as it went on, I thought, no, I can see where the plot threads are starting to converge. I can kind of see where all these things are starting to kind of make sense to a certain extent. That was my biggest concern of like I don't know if frustration's the right word, but there was that sense of like, where's this going? And that was definitely my primary concern with season three, despite the short span of the original series, Firewalk Me and the Missing Pieces.
And when did you started the podcast this year or last year?
Oh yeah, no, it was this year. It's something
Okay.
I actually had in my mind for the longest time. I must have had in my mind for at least a year or two. But I think there's like logistically of like how do I do this because
Yeah.
it was like saying before is that I couldn't think of anyone I knew in person, and then I was like, oh, maybe I could do it with like one of my friends who I met at a previous con, and then it just kind of turned into like, you know what? there's all these people who I've met and I've liked. I'm sure I could do that, but then it builds off. Like for example, John Bernardi, who I have to give endless credit to. He was supportive literally from day one from what I was doing, and I think that helped get my foot in the door. Where I was talking with him. Then I did Wyndham's Cabin over the summer. That's where I got
Yep.
to meet you.
Yep.
Got to see Emily Marinelli for the first time. Mel's from Damn Fine TV. And then it just kind of just turned into, oh wait, I can ask other people that I just know of, and then it just kind of like it just spiraled out from there.
So for the first, like, I guess to like say from the beginning of the pandemic to when you started the podcast for about 2 years, were you more like commenting on fan forums and sites and like interacting with other and sort of following other people's work on the show? Again, like your timeline is so interesting to me because it's like um to me, I've basically been doing the Twin Peaks, work around Twin Peaks for almost a decade now, and it feels sort of compressed to me. But then I think about somebody like you coming in, and you're having all these experiences just within the last 3 years, and it's like, wow, it actually has been a while. Like it's almost like different eras of the fandom. So, like for you, what was your perception during that time of like what, because you came into the Twin Peaks fandom at a time where I think some people who had sort of been following for a while felt like it was almost like tailing off a little bit. Like, okay, the return, it's now been a couple years since it was on. It looks like there's not going to be a follow up thing and people are sort of moving on or whatever. But like for you, you're coming right into it at that point. And to be fair, there's a ton of books being published around that time, podcasts. So did you have any sense of like, um, that was sort of that things were sort of slowing down, or did it seem completely, I guess, lively and active from your vantage point?
I think for me, I'm thinking of like mostly throughout like we'll say that back half of 2019. I
Mm-hmm.
remember I think it was on Twin Peaks Unwrapped. Maya McBriar talked about it where she kind of wanted to just be like her own thing, and like she kind of felt like if she kind of went to like a fest, it would diminish
Mm.
it. I was in a similar boat for a few months where I was like, oh, Twin Peaks, it means a very distinct thing to me.
Yeah.
Maybe I should kind of like, of course, I would love watching stuff from like Take the Ring or The Vlog Lady, but I think I by and large was like a little bit removed for a while. And strangely enough, like I was saying before, when I got to meet Cheryl Lee before COVID, it was actually the first con I've been to. And I'm not the type of person that's like not really my scene for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
but I happen to run into people like Pam from Between Two Worlds, Stephen Miller from Twin Peaks blog. There's a lot, Martin from Lynch Bricks. There's just a lot of people I just kind of ran into, and I genuinely like talking with. And that's when I started becoming like, oh, I want to talk with these people more. And then, of course, COVID happened, and then I was listening to a lot of Twin Peaks podcasts and listening to like a lot of people, their insight or reading what they had to say. So yeah, it's like I kind of like started off really slow, just like kind of passively thinking like, oh, what does this person have to say? Because I think for me, since I watched and read, well, actually, I watched all three seasons of the movie and read The Secret Diary in like a month and some change, and I think I just wanted time myself to think of how I felt about it before I had
Mm.
other views influence me. But once I
Yeah.
got more comfortable, I was like, oh, yeah, I'll check out this video from Take the Ring, or I'll see what this person has to say. But then, like, podcasters, where, especially during COVID, where that was like, all right, well, this is a good thing to do while I'm, like, working from home or while I'm, like, cleaning around the house. And then I was like, wow, there's a lot of people who put a lot of thought into this. And I kept on thinking of, like, how I view the characters and how I view
Mm.
all this stuff. And so for me, it's like I'm sure I think I showed it to you after my recording, but where like all the pages of notes that I've done is that yeah, I do write it for the podcast, but I've been thinking about a lot of these characters for years at this
Yeah.
point. Not like on a daily basis. Like for example, like I don't think of like say I don't know like Dr. Jacoby on a day to day basis, but he has come up enough. So once I got to the John Bernardi or when I got to recording the episode with John Bernardi, that's when I was like prepared for it. Is that there's a lot of stuff I was thinking about, with each rewatch or each time I read one of the Mark Frost books. So yeah, that's I guess that I hope that explains where I come from on it because again, it was like a really slow turnout at first, but then it just like front loaded into something much larger.
And I guess too, in your case, I was wondering, did you feel like there was sort of things tailing off because it had been so many years since the show? But if you're like experiencing all of it for the first time, you're not just catching up with whatever people are saying or doing at that time. You're also catching up with like the past, I guess, 30 years, depending how far back the resources go, like John Thorne's book and stuff like of people. So it's like with the show itself, you have all of that at your fingertips right at the outset. it's almost like overwhelming in a way, I would
Yeah,
imagine.
I guess that that's a really good thing to bring up because I feel like when I get into when I would read stuff about Twin Peaks, I get really into certain things. Like for example, beyond just watching Take the Ring or Wow Lynch Wow, I remember reading a lot more of Blue Rose before COVID,
Mm.
and that's when I was like, oh, I think there's some about the whole. Yeah, actually, I should probably point out that this is what I love about being part of Twin Peaks community is that it's mostly like feels like you're supporting a lot of local businesses in a lot of
It really
cases
does, yeah.
because it's
Everyone
like
knows each other.
yeah, like everyone knows each other. Scott Ryan is a great thing going for Blue Rose. Tweets Cafe, you can like help support them. There's all these like creative people on Etsy or friends that kind of just have their own things they make. So that's like another thing that really sustains itself. But coming back to the books and like everything, like say like wrapped in plastic or anything that people contribute. Sometimes I get really transfixed on the behind the scenes aspect, and other times I get really into like the in universe stuff, like the Mark Frost books. I think of like in late 2020, I remember I think I read The Essential Wrapped in Plastic and Reflections in a kind of short span. And also, actually, for that matter, conversation with Mark Frost. And I think my mindset behind that is that while you shouldn't really dictate what the creators think or what they don't think, I think in a lot of cases, your theories can be a little bit stronger if you know where they're coming from. So I was looking at stuff like that's why I bring up conversations with Mark Frost because he talks about a lot of the practical aspects of what it was like to work on Twin Peaks and non Twin Peaks stuff on a day to day basis. But
Hmm.
also, there's just a way where it's like when you learn about something behind the scenes, sometimes it can kind of like it can make you think of like a certain theory that you have, and it kind of reaffirm it? Does it go against it, or can you kind of be at peace with it? So that's a bit of an approach of how I view when I go through books like that.
At this point, we're going to switch into the Patreon back half of the discussion for $5 a month patrons to hear the full conversation. But before we get to that, I want to have you share where people can find you for the people watching right now on YouTube, and let them know where to follow you, where to find your work, and so forth.
As for social media, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Basically, if you type in "cream corn the universe" on Facebook or Instagram, that should come up pretty easily. My Twitter handle is at you stole the corn, and Podbean that shows all of my all where my all the platforms I'm on. Like I definitely I'm on naturally Podbean, but also Apple Podcasts. I'm on Google, Amazon, Spotify. I think most, if not all, the major platforms, and then there's a few smaller ones as well. So, and luckily, even if you just type in like cream corn on any of them, it's a pretty small search result. So,
Mm-hmm.
so it should be pretty easy to find, like regardless of how you find podcasts.
Not many fan pages for actual creamed corn.
No, not at all. At least none that I've come across.
Okay, so one thing I did want to ask you, since you hadn't seen Twin Peaks until a couple years after the return, what was it like when it came back? Like, were you aware of it at all? Were you oblivious to the fact? I mean, if you were following film, TV stuff, I guess at the time you probably would know it was coming back, but it wasn't like a huge deal for people who weren't already into Twin Peaks. So, what was your general awareness in like 2015 to 17 or so of the fact that Twin Peaks was going to come back and then did?
And that's it for this episode, the public portion. But of course, you can listen to the rest of this episode, which is longer than what you just listened to, on patreon.com/lost in the movies. It's another 40 minutes, really a sprawling discussion in which we talk about other Lynch films like Mulholland Drive, Lynch's connection to Tarantino, and all kinds of other topics. Talk more about his podcast. Also, public libraries comes up with the value of them. So it's very interesting. Definitely tune in so you can hear the follow up to that last question I asked, and much more. And of course, this podcast went up a little late. It was supposed to go up Halloween to be an October podcast, part of my Patreon rewards for this back half. And unfortunately, it didn't make it up in time. So now it's early November. And I'm hoping the next podcast will go up by late November. But I do have a conversation scheduled for like right after Thanksgiving. So if that ends up being the one that I put up in November, it might be a little late. If I can find somebody else before then, that would be the December one, so forth. For now, definitely check out that back part of the conversation and all the other great stuff that you can find on patreon.com as a patron. Not just the new stuff I put up every month, but a pretty vast archive including a lot of stuff, majority of stuff really, which has not been released publicly yet, and some of which has no plans to be. In addition to what you get at Twin Peaks Conversations, the Patreon podcast, and the Twin Peaks character advances every month, you also can just check out the whole backlog. So make sure you do that. Patreon.com/Lost in the Movies. See you there.